Okay, I'm going to get to it, and we'll get started. So, thanks everyone for inviting me to speak to your club this evening. The title of my talk is "The Honeybee Whisperer: How Carl von Frisch Revolutionized Our Knowledge About How Honeybees Experience the World." My name is Eric Smith, and I'm an EAS certified master beekeeper. I live in Danville, Pennsylvania. It's right in the middle of the state, just south of Route 80. So if you have driven through Pennsylvania, you can wave at me as you go by on Route 80. My main interests in beekeeping are focused around Darwinian beekeeping and the use of technology in beekeeping, the use of technology to solve real beekeeping problems. I consider myself a sideliner beekeeper. Beekeeping is not my day job. I have about 70 colonies spread about 2 bee yards here in central Pennsylvania. And just a little bit about some of the other projects that I'm working on. Um, right now, I'm very interested in doing some work on machine learning. One of the challenges that I'm having in my own beekeeping operation is keeping track of my bee log. This is a problem that I'm guessing some of the members here in the audience have tonight. In the upper left here, that's my stack of notes from 2022 that I still haven't typed in. So I'm looking to automate that process and do some automatic machine learning and recognize my handwriting and get that into an Excel spreadsheet for me automatically. So I'm working on that kind of right now is one of my bigger projects. Also really heavily focused on designing and 3D printing for beekeeping operations. All of my mating nukes, for example, are 3D printed. And I'm also interested or want to become more interested in microscopy, especially from the perspective of being able to identify pollen sources in honey. But enough about me. We're here to talk about the amazing man, Carl von Frisch. So who is Carl von Frisch? For those of you who don't know, a very brief biography of him. He was born in 1886, and as a boy, he loved animals, much to his parents' dismay. His father was a physician and wanted all of his children to follow in his footsteps, but Carl was really more interested in animals. So he went off to college to study medicine, trying to make his father happy. And after a few years, his father finally pulled him aside and said, "I think you would be happier studying zoology." So that's what he did. Received his PhD in 1910. His PhD work was on understanding the color vision of fish. He actually studied minnows in tanks in his lab. I have a photo of his lab here coming up in a minute. Um, After getting his PhD, he started working as a professor at the same university, and then World War One broke out. He was actually a medic in World War One. After the war, he collaborated with some donors in the United States to open a zoological institute at the University of Munich. He opened that in 1925. And then, unfortunately, we all know what happened in the 1930s in Europe. So World War II broke out, Nazis came to power, and unfortunately, because Karl von Frisch had a half-Jewish grandmother, he was constantly harassed by the Nazis. They constantly tried to fire him from his university position and eventually relented, mainly because at the time he was studying nosema disease, and that was affecting honeybees and therefore pollination and therefore crops. So the Nazis reluctantly allowed him to keep his position during the war. And actually, during the war, his home, his boyhood home, and the university, his zoological institute, were both destroyed. But after the war, he rebuilt, and that's when he really started some of the amazing work that we're going to talk about. And in 1950, that's when he published his seminal work about the honeybee dance language. We're going to talk a lot about that tonight. Retired in 1958, but kept doing research pretty much up until the point that he died in 1982. And he, of course, received the Nobel Prize in 1973 for his amazing work on the honeybee dance language. So I'm going to show a short video, and I'm just going to be quiet and let this play, and then we'll talk about it. And this is something that some of you may have seen in your own beekeeping operations. And the question to keep in mind as you watch this is, what's going on here? So it's been long observed back since the time of Aristotle, like 380 BC, that honeybees had this ability to do this all hands on deck type behavior when they discovered a rich food source. But no one has any idea at the time of how this happened or what is occurring to allow one bee who has a discovery of this nature to share that information with her nestmates, or at the time they would have said his nestmates. So, what's the answer? Well, that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So, let's get into it. So I've broken this talk down into 3 high-level sections that roughly follow the chronology of Carl von Frisch's research. So we'll start by talking about what do bees see, and then we'll shift into looking at what are the bees saying, and finally, what do the bees smell and taste. And at the end, I will have time for questions, and I will pause periodically for questions throughout the deck. So if you do have questions, you'll have an opportunity to ask them here shortly. So let's get into it. What do bees see? Why is he interested in what the bees see? Well, mostly because he was interested in what do fish see as part of his PhD research. So this is Carl von Frisch's lab, circa 1909. I couldn't find an actual date for this, so that's more or less a guess. But he did a lot of work to understand if fish, particularly a species of minnow that he used in his research, had the ability to see colors. And his work was published in 1912, where he showed that these fish could in fact distinguish colors, and they had color vision similar to that of humans. And what I think is really interesting about this is keep in mind this is a young aspiring scientist, just finished his PhD and published this work saying that minnows can see colors. At the very same time, the same year, a very well-renowned scientist called Carl von Hess, interestingly enough, who was a researcher at a university, published a book saying that minnows and other animals cannot see color. So right out of the gate, he was kind of challenged by the establishment as to his findings, and that would sort of be a theme in his research as we go along. So we're talking about honeybee vision. So this is a natural extension of Carl von Frisch's work with fish. And as you may know, honeybees have 2 different kinds of eyes. We see a drone honeybee in the cell. So he is just about ready to emerge and begin life as a drone. And we have those 2 large drone eyes. Those are the ommatidium, and those are the compound eyes. And we also have the ocelli. They're 3 simple eyes. So we know that bees have eyes, so we assume that they can see, but we don't really know for sure. So how do we figure it out? Do they see? What can they see? And the real question here, the question I find amazing, is how can you possibly figure this out? You can't Vulcan mind meld with a bee and understand what they're seeing. But this is where the amazing scientific mind of Carl von Frisch comes into play. And so I'm going to talk about a couple of his experiments. And this is one of his first experiments that he carried out to understand if honeybees can see colors. So what he has is, you see a 4x4 plate. This is actually like a glass plate, and each of the circles is an indentation that can hold a small amount of liquid. So what he did was place colored card under the glass tray with the indentations, and he would train the bees that, in this example, there would be a sweet sugary reward, so sugar syrup, in the well that was over the blue colored plate. And then he also put a series of grayscale images behind the remaining plates. And the idea here is that if the honeybees can see color, they'll be able to distinguish the blue plate from all of the other plates. But if they can't see colors, the blue is going to appear as just another shade of gray. And as bees come and return to the plate, like we saw in that earlier example, the time-lapse video I shared earlier, when new bees are recruited and come to find the food source, they if they can't see the different colors, they would go to one of the grayscales that matches it. And what Carl von Frisch found, of course, is that bees can, in fact, see color, and they could be very easily trained to go to certain colors and not other colors. And we'll talk about the other colors here in a moment. But encouraged by these early results, he came up with a more in-depth experiment that he focused on later in his research. And in these experiments, he used these series of little bee boxes. So he built these boxes, and inside of the box, he placed a sugar reward, so sugar syrup, and he would train the bees that if they came to a certain box, in this case, the syrup reward is in the blue box. We already know that the bees have the ability to see the blue color based on his experiment with the glass plates. So the bees would be trained that there is a sweet reward in the blue box, and they would return to the blue box. And if you look carefully, you can see where it says blue and yellow in this diagram. Those are actually just pieces of plywood that are painted the various colors that he was using for the experiment. So what he would do is after the bees are trained, in this example, trained to go to the blue color, he would move the blue to a different plate, but he would leave the sugar reward where it was. So he would move the blue. In this case, everything just got shifted one position to the left. And as you probably have guessed at this point, the bees that were visiting the blue box before would return and go right back to the blue box, even though now there is no sweet reward in that blue box. So he was able to prove rather definitively that honeybees can distinguish colors. And he repeated this experiment over and over and over again, hundreds of times, with different colored plates on the outside of the test area to determine which colors bees could distinguish and which colors bees could not distinguish. For example, if he put a red plate, a red colored board in front of the training area, the bees would not follow that red when they moved it. They were not able to distinguish the red from other colors of grayscale colors. So by iterating on this experiment over and over and comparing different colors, he was able to come up with the honeybee spectrum, which you see here. And this is actually from one of Carl von Frisch's books. And you see along the bottom, these are the 4 honeybee colors: yellow, blue, green, blue, and violet. Interestingly, blue-green is a unique color to the honeybees. It's not blue and green. They see the combination of blue-green as a distinct color. So if you're painting your beehives and you want to make sure you're using colors that the bees can tell apart, those are where you want to stay: yellow, blue, green, blue, and ultraviolet. But what about ultraviolet? Where does that come into play? You can't really get ultraviolet paint and paint your beehives that color, but it definitely is a benefit to the bees in somehow. But what is it a benefit to? How is that a benefit to honeybees? Let's take a look at some very popular bee flowers. So these are all flowers from around my neighborhood where my bees are foraging. We have coneflower, chicory, and panicled aster. And if we take another look at these same flowers, but through a ultraviolet camera, things look very different. So here we can see on the left, the coneflower, you can see the petals are a brilliant white when seen in ultraviolet. The chicory, you can see, if you look very closely, you can see some stripes of white in the petals. The petal on the lower right has some, you can see some white built in there as well. And my favorite, I think, is the panicled aster on the right. You can see very clearly the ultraviolet reflectivity of the flowers. These are called nectar guides. You've probably heard about this, and they exist. They've evolved along with the honeybees so that the honeybees see this when they're flying. When a honeybee is foraging, she sees these basically landing strips guiding her to a rich food reward. So it's a benefit to the flower, it's a benefit to the bee, and it's a great example of coevolution of bees and flowers, and a beautiful example of symbiosis. He also did a number of other experiments to see what other sorts of things bees can see. And one of the interesting experiments that he did was to determine that honeybees can see polarized light. And he did this through a series of experiments. And Carl von Frisch is a really interesting, fascinating scientist. And some of his experiments kind of remind me of mad scientist type experiments. And this is a great example. One of the things that he did was to build these large research shacks or enclosures, as you can see in the photo here in the upper left, where inside of this, there was an observation hive. And he would crawl inside of there, and he had the ability to make it dark. And he had the ability with a window to allow light in, or he could close the window. He could place a polarizing filter over the light. He could control the environment inside of this enclosure to carry out his experiments. And the way that he determined that bees can see polarized light is by placing polarized film over the window. Kind of like if you have polarized sunglasses, you can use that to filter out one polarization of light versus another, or you can use that to angle and change the angle of polarization of light. And he actually determined that honeybees can see polarized light, and then they actually use it to aid them in navigation. So on the right here in this panel where you see 1, 2, 3, and 4, this is Carl von Frisch's artificial honeybee eye. And in one of his books, he actually describes how to build this, and he uses this in his research. And this is very similar to the mechanism in the honeybee eye that has polarizing filters built into it as part of the evolution of the eye. And here's one that I built. And what you're looking at here is this is looking straight up into the sky. And on the right, you see a compass direction, but it's mirrored because, again, we're looking straight up. So if you were looking down through this, you would see the compass directions. And I'm going to play the video. And let me pull play. There we go. And you'll notice the pattern of polarization. Notice the dark bands are always going from west to east as I turn this around. So honeybees are able to see these patterns of polarization in the sky. And as it turns out, the pattern of polarization in the sky follows a very repeatable, definitive pattern as the sun moves from east to west as it rises in the morning and sets in the evening. And the honeybees are able to see the sky. They're able to see this light polarization, and they're able to tell not only the direction of they're able to basically discern compass direction, and they're able to discern time of day from the polarized light in the sky. So this is why you often hear people say that honeybees can't fly or can't navigate on a cloudy day. This is the origin of that. Turns out they can navigate as long as they can see the tiniest little sliver of blue sky. So you could have a 99.9% cloudy day. As long as there's a little bit of blue sky coming through, the honeybees are able to use the polarized light to navigate, and they'll be out foraging on a day like that. This is one of Carl von Frisch's books. He published this in 1914, and I just thought this was very interesting that he included the actual paint samples that he used in a lot of his research. I thought that was amazing, especially for something in 1914 where you didn't have a color laser printer. You had to really do a lot of work to publish a book like this, and that just speaks to the sort of work that he did. And this book, unfortunately, is in German, and there hasn't been an English translation I've been able to find, so I haven't been able to read it. I'm going to pause there. This is the end of the first section, and just see if there's any questions from the group.
Any questions? Well, pink is not a color. Pink is the absence of green. Yeah. It's a human thing. Any other questions? Well, I see people now. Anything else?
It's safe to assume that plants that are blue-green are the most popular for the bees to harvest the pollen.
I'm not sure about most popular, but that definitely, when I see a flower that has blue or blue-green petals on it, that is a sure sign that is an insect-pollinated flower. Versus, for example, a red flower, that's going to be a bird-pollinated flower. So, yeah, absolutely.
Anything else? Is pink an issue for painting a colony?
If you had, for example, a couple of shades of pink, the bees are going to see that as shades of gray, right? So it's not that they can't see it, but it's not going to be very distinguished to them. So if you want to make sure that it's something that they can see and remember, bees evolve to recognize flowers. So if you want, the usual use case here, right, is to make sure that if you're doing queen production, that you want to make sure that your queen is able to find her way back after she takes her nuptial flights. So if that's your intent, then I think it's really important to stick to the to Von Frisch colors. But if you're just painting your hives to give them different colors and kind of just a general different appearance, right? If you have a pink hive on the left and just a traditionally white painted hive on the right, the bees will see those differently. They'll see one as white and they'll see one as a shade of gray. So it would still help to distinguish it. So I guess it depends on why you're painting your hives. Personally, I paint my hives whatever color paint I get at the mist tint paint section at Home Depot. So that's how I paint my hives. But my mating nukes, I almost always make sure I have some yellow or some blue on them in some variety or different patterns to help the queens on the nuptial flight, especially when you're using queen castles where you have a very dense population. I think it's really important there to have some distinguishing characteristics of very vibrant, very contrasting bee colors on a queen castle to help with your queen production. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, what does the bee see in the blue flowers in an ultraviolet light?
Well, it would depend on the flower, right? I'm just going to go back here a bit. Oops, sorry. So here we see in the upper right is the blue chicory.
The one in the upper right-hand corner.
Yeah, exactly. So, and under the ultraviolet, you can see those nectar guides in the petals. So this is not, I'm not saying this is what the bee sees. This is just simply what an ultraviolet camera sees. So a bee would see a combination of the blue and the ultraviolet together. And the specific details of the nectar guides would depend on the species of flower. Okay. Let's get back to where we were. Okay. So one of the things that came out of this research that Carl von Frisch did, and you can read this in his writings, as he's doing all of this work, he's observing these bees, he's studying bees in observation colonies. He's always seeing honeybees doing a dance language of some kind. They're doing a dance. And everyone has seen this, I'm guessing. Oops, sorry. Let me... So that's an example of the honeybee dance that has been known since ancient times. Aristotle wrote about the honeybee dance, and even in some of Carl von Frisch's work, when he wrote about his observations in earlier experiments, he was hypothesized that this maybe had something to do with the pollen requirements of the colony, because he noticed that the dances happened more often when the colony was in need of pollen or was actively collecting pollen. But that wasn't his initial research focus. These are just some observations he made while working on his other experiments in terms of color recognition. But later in his work, he started really focusing on this and set himself the task to figure out what this meant. Here are a few photographs.
Hey, Eric, that video was not much of a video.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah,
we kind of saw bits and pieces of it.
Okay. Let me try it again. I was having some glitchiness here as well. I had to restart it. I'm going to try it again. Is that any better?
No.
No. Okay. Well, we'll have to make do. So apologies for the technical problems here. It's playing okay on this end, so maybe there's something with the screen share that's causing it not to play. But what we observed here was a bee making a. Can you see my mouse cursor? Is that coming through?
Yes.
Okay, so you saw a bee basically making a dance. She would waggle like this, and she's walking, and then she'd turn around and walk back to the start, and then she would waggle again, and then she would turn around the other way like this, and she would repeat that pattern over and over. So Carl von Frisch was determined to figure out what this meant. A few photographs of Carl von Frisch doing his research. I can't imagine. This man must have spent thousands of hours staring at observation hives. It's quite amazing the dedication he put into determining this. And did a series of experiments where with observation hives, as you see here, and feeding stations. So he would put out in the field near an observation hive a small table with a small dish that contained a sweet reward, sugar syrup typically, and he would observe the behavior of bees visiting that feeder and then returning to the hive. And the way that he actually did this was to come up with this kind of ingenious color code. So this is the Carl von Frisch's color code. And so what he did was he or one of his assistants or grad students would be sitting at one of these feeding locations, and another researcher would be back at the observation hive. So anytime a bee came to the feeding location, the bee would be marked with paint
you're
dots.
Breaking up a bit there, Eric.
What was the last thing that you heard?
You're coming in and out a little bit.
Okay.
Weird.
Okay, I'm going to keep going. Just to let me know if it happens again, and we'll back up and make sure that everyone can hear. Okay.
Okay.
But yeah, this is the color code, the color sequence that von Frisch used to mark the bees. So bees would land at a feeding station, and each bee would be marked with a color code. And by using these 5 colors and a series of 1 or 2 dots on the thorax and 1 dot on the abdomen, he could mark up to 599 individual bees using this color code. So this was a huge part of the research that von Frisch was able to do. So when the bee would return to the hive, a marked bee would then dance, and Carl von Frisch would be able to make observations about what was going on in the hive.
Breaking up.
Do you have any suggestions, Justin?
Do you happen to be on Wi-Fi?
Nope. You want to try Teams or something else?
Go ahead and give that a
You want to try again?
Yeah, let's see. And just keep on going. Let's see if that improves things at all.
Okay.
Made an adjustment.
Okay. What was the did the description of the color codes come through okay, or should I go over that again?
Yeah, I'd say that came through all right.
Okay. We'll keep plugging along. Again, here's another photograph of one of von Frisch's experimental setups. This is actually the same photo that we saw a moment ago. And here's another video. So after a lot of research, is this coming through, Justin?
It was. Oh, there we go. Yeah. Yeah. No need to waggle your cursor this time.
Okay, good. So this is what von Frisch discovered, the honeybee waggle dance. And it's quite incredible. So I'm going to, I ruthlessly stole this video from the Smithsonian channel, as you can see, but it needs a slight adjustment. There we go. That's much better. So this is the honeybee waggle dance. So the straight line portion of the honeybee waggle dance communicates the distance between the colony, the hive entrance, and a food source. You can see here as noted at a flower. The longer the bee sends in this straight line waggle dance, the further away the food resource is. And the angle of the dance relative to the vertical represents the angle between the sun, the hive, and the food source. So, for example, on the left, if we have a food source that is directly towards the sun with respect from the hive, so from the hive to the food source, we're looking directly at the sun, the waggle dance direction will be straight up in the colony. So that's basically saying that the food is directly towards the sun when you leave the hive entrance. And if the food is at an angle, in this example, the food source is 40 degrees to the left of the sun, the waggle dance will be 40 degrees to the left of the vertical within the colony. And the amount of work that he did to determine this is really amazing. So this is a graph from his research. And I just want to point out the highlighted section that he watched 3,885 waggle dances that corresponded to known feeding locations. So this is situations where a bee was at a feeding location where they knew the distance and direction, and they observed the waggle dance and were able to basically plot this graph. And you can see an absolute correlation between the amount of time that's spent in the waggle dance. Actually, in this graph, he records number of cycles of the dance in 15 seconds because that's simply easier to count if you're looking at an observation hive. But it corresponds to the inverse of the time spent. So the longer time spent in the waggle dance, the further away the food resource is. So really amazing that it correlates to this degree. But that wasn't enough for Carl von Frisch. He wanted to learn more. Having figured this out, he really wanted to understand, is it really distance and is it really direction, or is it something else? So there was a whole series of other experiments that took place with von Frisch and some collaborators after his initial discovery of the waggle dance. That, again, these are the Carl von Frisch wearing the mad scientist hat type of experiments here. So for example, he fitted some bees at the feeding location. They would glue little lead weights to their thorax and then measure the dance of the bees that had the extra weight attached to them. The photo on the right shows another experiment where they added little pieces of aluminum foil to the thorax of bees. The idea with that was to increase wind resistance. They also did a series of experiments where there was an obstacle between the hive and the feeding location. And this, in this diagram, you see the feeder is at the bottom. It's marked F. The hive location is marked ST at the top, the start. And the arrow is the direction indicated by the waggle dance. And it's really fascinating because the conclusion of this research is that the commonly held description of the waggle dance, in that it communicates distance and direction, isn't quite right. What it communicates is two things. It communicates not distance, but it actually communicates how much energy the bee needs to expend to get from the hive to the food source and back. And this always reminds me of those like World War II movies where the bombers leave on a bombing mission and the pilot and the navigator are talking about, we need to turn back now or we're not going to have enough fuel to return to the base. Is exactly what it is for honeybees. As it turns out, the honeybee will load up with just enough honey or nectar in her stomach to power her flight to that food location and back to the nest. So it's a measure of how much energy needs to be expended to get from the hive to the feeding location and back. So Carl von Frisch discovered that if you added extra weight, the dance tends to indicate that the food location is further away. It's going to take more energy to get there. If the bee has to fly into a headwind, it's harder for her to fly into the wind. then it's going to indicate a longer distance. Or if there's a tailwind, it'll indicate a shorter distance. If there's a crosswind, she'll compensate for that with the angle. So the angle that she'll indicate to her sisters as to the location of the food source, she will actually compensate that. So for example, if the wind is blowing a little bit to the left, her dance is going to angle a little bit to the east just to compensate for that wind. And the same thing happens if the food source is up a hill or down a hill. Rather amazing. So the bees are actually able to do all of this calculation and dance and share this information with their sisters with a brain that weighs 2 milligrams and has 1 million neurons. Compare that to a human with our 1.3 million milligrams, which is the equivalent of 3 pounds, and 86 billion neurons. So honeybees are fascinating. I think everyone in the room here already knows that, but the more you learn about them, the more fascinating that they get. And there's this great von Frisch quote that I've included on a few of the slides here at the top that I think really sums up the magic and amazing abilities and capabilities of these amazing little insects that we all love and care for. So I'll pause there and see if there are any questions before we go on to the next section.
Good to go.
Okay, great. Okay, last section is what do bees smell and taste? And what's really fascinating about the remainder of Carl von Frisch's work is at this point, he has a method by which he can understand what the bees are saying. He's deciphered the dance language. And he uses this to further understand what's going on with honeybees and a number of experiments and things he can learn by deciphering and understanding the bee language when the bees are placed in a number of new situations. And one of the ways that he did this, one of the topics rather that he looked at to understand using the dance language is how do bees smell and taste, or what do bees smell and taste when they're consuming or interacting with food resources. And he did this with a bunch of really clever experiments. So, and I've just picked a few here to talk about this evening. So this is pretty typical. So in this experiment, what he did was he made phlox flavored syrup. So sugar syrup, and it sent it with the flowers of phlox to give that syrup a taste, if you will, since it's in a liquid. Phlox tea, basically, phlox sweet tea. And put a feeding station 20 meters away from an observation hive. And then what he did was put out at the same distance around the observation hive some actual phlox flowers and some other flowers, cyclamen, for example, that he used. And he observed which bees landed on these flowers. So what happened was that bees would be recruited to a dance. He would observe this in the observation hive, and his assistants at the flower locations would count the number of bees that showed up. So in this case, bees were feeding on phlox-flavored syrup at 20 meters. When they took that feeding location away and replaced it with flowers, the bees all went to the same scent, the same flavor, if you will, of phlox flowers. So that proved that scent or taste of the food resource factors into the communication and the recruitment of foragers in some fashion. But he did some more experiments, and they get really, really interesting. So what happens if you have that same phlox-flavored syrup, but then you surround the feeder with cyclamen flowers? So the bees are going to alight at the feeder. They're going to have to crawl through these flowers, and they're going to get that scent on the outside of their body. What happens then? It's really interesting. So at 20 meters, so pretty close to the colony, most of the recruited bees then went to the cyclamen flowers. So in this case, the external scent, if you will, the scent that's sticking to the outside of the bee's body, was the most important factor in recruiting other foragers. So a few landed on the phlox, but the vast majority went to the cyclamen flowers. But it gets really interesting. What happens if you repeat this exact same experiment, but you have the feeding location is 600 meters away, so considerably further away? So what happens at 600 meters is that Almost no. In this case, only one recruit arrived at the cyclamen flowers, but 38 arrived at the phlox flowers. So Carl von Frisch was able to determine that both the flavor, if you will, and the scent of a flower factor into the recruitment process. But at long distances, it seems that the external scent basically wears off. And the theory here is that that long flight back from the flower to the hive is simply enough time and enough airflow that the scent gets degraded, and the stronger of the two scents at that point would be the flavor of the syrup. So it's really fascinating to see he's able to use the dance language and decipher the dance language to learn about how honeybees taste and smell things and how that factors into the recruitment process. And he did a number of other really fascinating experiments. I kind of added another category here. But once he had figured this out, he basically had unlocked the key of communicating with the honeybees and was able to do a huge series of experiments to learn more about them. And I just have a couple examples of this. There are so many more. I could talk about this for hours. He looked at whether honeybees are affected by magnetic fields. And in his research, he found that they are not. He did a series of experiments where on the left, you can see the observation hive itself. He placed it inside of a large electromagnet that would allow him to change the magnetic field. So he could basically zero out the Earth's magnetic field with his apparatus, or he could change it. And in his work with the studying the dance language, he found no change. He also did a number of experiments with this landing plate. So the theory here was that if honeybees are using the Earth's magnetic field for some sort of navigation, they would align their takeoffs from this feeding location with the magnetic field. So if the hive was to the south, if they were using the magnetic field, for example, they would always leave in that same direction. So we did a number of series of experiments. On the left, you can see the graph you're looking at there represents the length of the bars around the circle represent the relative number of bees, excuse me, the relative number of bees that left that feeder in that direction. And then on the right is that same experiment done, but in this case, that electromagnet was turned on and the Earth's magnetic field was rotated. And as you can see, there was basically no difference. The direction the bees left from the feeding location was unaffected by the presence of a magnetic field. So he was able to determine that as well. And this has to be my favorite mad scientist, Carl von Frisch experiment. They were interested to know if honeybees have a sense of time. Do they have an internal clock? So they built this series of enclosures, and on the left you see the inside of the enclosure. They added a number of things in here. So obviously there's a bee colony that is able to exit from the hive and fly around this little room, basically. And in here, there is a feeding station. They even put decorations on the wall so the bees had something to orient against. And what they did was train the bees that at a certain time of day, so every day at 10 in the morning, the feeder would be filled. And the feeder there is on that little table A on the right. So every day at the same time, that feeder would be filled. And so the bees would show up in anticipation of it. So they could be trained to time of day as well as he learned. So the bees would show up at the same time of day. And what they actually did was they packed these on an airplane and they flew it from Paris to New York and determined that, yes, the honeybees would still visit that feeder at the same time of day that in Germany. So at 10 a.m. in Germany, the bees would still visit that feeder. So it was unaffected by anything else. This is a dark box, so you couldn't see the daylight, but it shows that honeybees do have an internal clock and a sense of time. So that was one of my favorite experiments, and I would have loved to have been in the room when he wrote the grant to pay for planes to ship these giant honeybee colonies to the United States just to perform this experiment. So that's all I have for tonight. There's so much more I could talk to you about the amazing work that Carl von Frisch has done. as you may have picked up, I have a major beekeeper crush on Carl von Frisch. I think he is an amazing scientist, and he really set the groundwork for some of the more amazing work that was done, specifically by Tom Seeley, who kind of took this on. And if you've read any of Tom Seeley's work, you know that he discovered that the dance language factors into nest site recruitment among honeybee swarms and other things. If you want to learn more about Carl von Frisch, there are a couple of books I recommend that I've put up here on the screen. The two on the left are by Carl von Frisch. They are unfortunately out of print, but if you're patient on eBay, you can find them. I'll start by recommending the book in the middle, just simply called Bees, The Vision, Chemical Senses, and Language by Carl von Frisch. This is a small, easy to read book. It's really great. Highly recommend everyone pick this up. And if you're careful on eBay, you can get this for about the Bees book for about $20. They do occasionally show up. The book on the left is basically an English translation of all of his research. And so this was published to coincide with a tour that he took in the United States later in his career. This book is really hard to find, but if you can get your hands on it, I highly recommend it. It's really fascinating. And the book on the right, The Dancing Bees, is a biography by Tanya Munz and talks a lot about Carl von Frisch's life and research. And if you're interested in him, it's a very good read as well. So, yeah, that's all I have. I'd be happy to take any questions from the group.
To your knowledge, have any of those books been digitized?
They have not. Actually, the Bees book, you can find a PDF of that. I believe I found a PDF of the Bees book, but I definitely haven't found the dance language. I have not found that. I do have a PDF of the book that's in German, but if anybody tracks it down, please let me know. I'd be interested to know.
Eric, my question is this. Does the research, either von Frisch's research or your own research, support the use of supplements when you feed the bees, such as Honeybee Health, based on his discovery that they do have essential taste?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Does Dr. von Frisch's research or your own research based on that support the use of supplements to attract bees to when we feed them, such as when we use Honeybee Healthy as supposed to attract them?
Nothing in. I personally don't use Honeybee Healthy, so I can't really speak to its efficacy. And nothing in Carl von Frisch's work, at least nothing that I've read, he really. I don't think he did anything with changing feeding supplements. He was an ethologist, so he would strictly study bees in their quote unquote natural environment. Granted, he built all these crazy contraptions, but he didn't really do any work around, giving them supplemental food or drug treatments or anything like that. So nothing to my knowledge can speak to pros or cons of using something like that.
In reference to the water source, my understanding is, for example, you have a water source and you put 2 drops of chlorine in it, starts acting for that.
Yeah. So with the water, what I've personally noticed in my own operation, and some of you have probably observed this as well. I'll actually just tell you the first time I really noticed this. So I was, my son at the time had an aquarium that he was 6 or 7 years old at the time, and he had an aquarium with some goldfish that he didn't take very good care of. It was in his bedroom, and so it got really kind of gross. So we took it outside and cleaned it and dumped out that mucky, gross aquarium water in the backyard. And for whatever reason, the bees loved it. And the current thinking is there's 2 schools of thought on this, and I personally don't know where I personally land, is that A, the bees are going after it for the nutrients, or B, the bees are recruited to it simply because they can be recruited to it. So if you remember earlier, we looked at the experiments that von Frisch did with the scented syrup, the flavored syrups. So that definitely factors into the ability for recruits to find the food source. So the idea is, and it's generally understood that what happens is the recruit gets distance and direction information and some sort of taste or scent of the food. Sometimes during the waggle dance, you'll see trophallaxis going on. You'll always see bees touching the dancer with their antennae, so they're basically tasting or smelling the outside of that bee. So taste slash flavor is definitely a huge factor in it. So if the water source, if it's completely pure water, there's really nothing for the bees to associate the dance with. But if there's a scent to it, chlorine, for example, some people like to use essential oils. Tom Seeley talks about using anise extract. That's very popular. Bees really are attracted to that. But just giving the water something so that when the first recruit finds it and she goes back to the hive and does a dance for water recruitment for her nestmates, she can give them a taste of what they're looking for. And I certainly think that's a good way to go.
One other question regarding their movements. I've heard a thing called washboarding.
I'm sorry? Could you speak up?
I've heard this, one of their dances or movements that you might observe is called washboarding. Do you know much about that?
Washboarding on the outside of the colony. Yeah, to my knowledge, that we don't really know what that is yet. It's different from bearding. Bearding is, typically due to heat. Washboarding is a different phenomenon entirely. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we know for sure what that's all about yet. So still lots of opportunities for the next generation of Carl von Frisches to keep learning more things about honeybees. Any other questions?
Okay, Eric, thank you so much. We have no more questions.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
well, thanks everyone.
good.
Appreciate it. If anybody has any questions or wants to get a hold of me, let me just put this slide up for a second with my email address on it. If you have any questions or you think of anything later on, please do feel free to reach out. And I do want to leave you with one fun beekeeping trick that you can take home. So those ultraviolet photographs that I showed, you can take those yourself, and it's really actually pretty easy. All you have to do is get one of these light bulbs that are available at Halloween.
I think you stopped sharing your screen.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me try this again.
Oh, we
Is
are
that
not
coming
seeing
through?
or hearing you.
Hello?
Nope. Hi.
Hello, hello?
Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Anything? Okay, well...
we just heard you come back. Oh, there you are.
Okay, is it working now?
Yeah.
All right, hold on. Let me...
By
Right.
happenstance, are you on Wi-Fi at home?
No, it's wired, and I have a gig connection here.
That's what I figured. It's probably on this end.
Yeah, no worries. My screen coming through?
Nope, doesn't look like you're. It looks like you stopped sharing it.
It just... Hold on a second. Entire screen.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay.
We can see it
Is
now.
that working? Okay, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I just wanted to... So these photos, you can actually take those yourself at home, and it's actually really easy. So what you do... Pardon me as I scan through the deck here. All you need to do is get one of these black light bulbs and smash it with, a hammer or something, and don't cut yourself, be careful, and just take a small piece of that black glass and just tape it over the lens of your camera, your smartphone camera. And you have to do this on a really, really bright day because you're basically cutting out so much of the light. But if you do this on a really sunny day, you can take those photographs. So do this, and you're out walking around, you see a bee flower, take a picture of it through a piece of blacklight glass, and you'll be amazed that you can see those nectar guides that easily. So that's a cool way you can kind of explore nature in a different way, just with a blacklight light bulb. So just wanted to share that trick, and hope that you guys get an opportunity to make use of that when you're out and about. So with that, I'll let you go and have the rest of your meeting.
That is a neat trick.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so
enjoyed
much for
talking to you.
speaking to us tonight.
My pleasure. Bye, everyone.